That is serious brain food. We had our annual conference last week about this subject. We decided that we would bring speakers from other sectors. And we talked about brand, and we talked about reputation, and we talked about 2 speakers on open data and big data and transparency of data. And we had Rolls-Royce talking about supply chain. And next year you'll be getting the invitation. So I've come all the way to the Amsterdam to meet someone whose office is 10 minutes away from me. You know? So thank you for that as well. This is very different because I'm taking a top-down, a sector level view of innovation. So I think it might make for some interesting contrast actually. To set the context and actually straight away to sort of enable those of you to compare who don't know the UK market, just to compare your country with our macro situation, but also straight away to highlight 1 or 2 things which are actually barriers to innovation in the very structure of the construction industry in the UK. Our country is 64 million, 2.1 million people, about 8% of the working population work in construction. But if you add in property, if you add in maintenance management, you know, there'll be a lot of your staff aren't classed as construction, but they are working in buildings or on buildings. So it's a much bigger sector than it's given credit for. 9% are women, only 9% are women. Come back to that later if you like. 95% are small, medium-sized companies, and we're building almost as low as half the rate that all the housing economists reckon we need to satisfy demand. Now again, that must be a common debate in this forum. So there are some barriers in there. I mean, how on earth do you change that? That all just looks too difficult, doesn't it? Well, we're a not-for-profit organisation. We bring together customers, clients, people who fund construction. We bring them together with contractors, with architects, engineers, lawyers, IT companies, all sorts of stakeholders, product manufacturers, big players, to basically sit down and talk about ideas, talk about how do you improve the construction industry. So we become a knowledge broker, if you like, an intermediary, if you like these sorts of descriptions, but a knowledge transfer network would be another description of that. And we have a big regional network, and I spend my time with the innovators, with the real people doing something really radically different, which actually in construction at the moment is generally around 2 areas. Radical innovation, it's around products and materials like graphene, and it's around technology, data and digital, and the use thereof. And we're just scratching the surface compared with some of the brilliant stuff you've just heard. We've also got 9 worldwide partners, and yes, I didn't think of it, but what Ilya and I should have done was some sort of double act, because you had Vernieuwingbouw here, and now we've just been this morning to see Bouwcampus. And they're one of 10 partners, organisations a bit like us around the world, with whom we have formed an international alliance. And we're currently using that alliance particularly to try to make a difference in the Middle East, in Qatar and the UAE, and we're having some big issues there around worker welfare and migrant workers and so on and so forth. So you can see that the sort of topics I deal with are innovation in some very basic, proper human rights stuff, all the way up to the very leading edge of 3D, 4D, 5D modelling of built environment assets and the data implications and how you might use that in the future. We're originally funded by government, now we're funded by industry. What that does is change us from a push to a pull organisation. So those of you in this sort of space, instead of the government saying, we're going to fund some research and we're the government and we know how to help you, you know, one of the greatest contradictions in the UK that you could possibly think of. Now it's the industry doing this because it wants it. It has a problem, it has a challenge, it wants to fund some work to see things better. We pull research out of universities, we do a lot of benchmarking. We've been measuring performance on projects for nearly 20 years, as I'll show you in a minute. And we do a lot of work on demonstration. So our evidence, which is the right-hand side here, is coming from 3 main sources, our ideas and evidence. We're very evidence-based. You know, we've got some ideas. Usually our companies have got ideas or challenges, and what we're about is seeking to evidence whether they work or not. And if they do work, then we'll tell people about it, which is the rest of the cycle. We've been doing this for 20 years. My view is that this is really helpful to set a context, to set a national strategy. It's just that we've had 5 of them. A national strategy where a sector is saying, we've got a vision of where we want to be. We need to be world class, whatever that means, within X years, and that's how we're going to get there. Actually, of course, real change happens by individual companies, small, medium or large, coming up with new business models which will make them more money. That's how real innovation will happen. But construction, because of how important it is, because of how big it is, has such a range of stakeholders impacting on the process. One or two of you may well be planners, you know, vital part of, I don't want anyone building anything, you know, just being allowed to build anything they want to, which might be unsafe or completely inappropriate for that area based on town planning or based on architectural principles or whatever. So I'm quite pleased as a planning process, but it is often a barrier to certain types of innovation, as well as a protector of, you know, good built environments. You might want to talk about that a bit later if you like. So our strategy has evolved. We've had strategies which involve, but this is just one of those strategies, and it just shows you a sort of an innovation strategy, if you like, at a sector level, written by a set of clients in the late 1990s who were hugely dissatisfied with the service they were getting. Originally challenged by the Deputy Prime Minister, who felt that housing was terrible standard and not enough and too expensive in the UK in the mid-late 90s. And the Deputy Prime Minister set out, for those of you who were in the UK at the time, for the £60,000 house. 60 or £50,000? £60,000 house. House only, not land. Therein, by the way, lies the answer to the dilemma of why aren't we seeing innovation in housing in the UK. But anyway, Egan wrote this report. He was actually more interested in building Terminal 5 at Heathrow, which is one of the great airport terminals of the world, on many scales the best terminal in the world, and it was built under Sir John Egan's, or was commissioned under John Egan's time as Chief Executive of the then British Airports Authority. But he wrote this with a number of clients from other industries, including, quite significantly, the then Chief Executive, UK Managing Director of Toyota Cars. So you've got a big focus on lean manufacturing processes, those sorts of ideas. The most important thing is almost forget the themes on the left, although they are all important to the theme of the day, is the idea of targets on the left. Now this was classic top-down government target making. They came up with those targets. 10% of what? And there was no baseline. There was no measurement of any of those factors in the UK construction industry at that time. And by the way, does that seem familiar? There is lots of target making done like this at a government level, which is supposed to incentivise and create opportunities for innovation. It's actually completely the wrong way around in terms of policy making. Should we not get some data about the current situation and then look at the performance gap to where we want to get to? And now you've got a chance of year-on-year targets. Nevertheless, this coincided, so there's the key about the targets. We set out, therefore, around at about the same time, we realised, well, we better collect some data then. And we began collecting data. Now, it almost doesn't matter what the data is on for the purpose of the discussion about innovation. It's the fact that you start to measure this data and you collect it regularly, in our case at a sector level, but for an individual company, for the first time ever in construction, this is only 15 years ago, we started collecting data on what your average project does in terms of performance when building a building. And by the way, this covers housing all the way up to power stations. Not that we were building many at the time, but we're building a few nuclear ones at the moment. And everything in between. And it also covers maintenance projects above a certain scale, above about £100,000 euros-ish for a project. And we started measuring those things because they linked back to those things. And so we had finally some data to understand where we currently were. And since then, at my level, if you like, at a sector level, we start to track how we're doing. Now, safety became a really important starting point. Those of you how many of you work as deliverers, as builders, or people delivering the construction, delivering housing? How many of you, how many are customers for it? How many of you buy new buildings from time to time? Half a dozen. Thank you. How many of you are responsible for management or maintenance of property? Okay, there's a few more there. So that's although they were all clustered in the middle rows.
We don't dare to.
My point is that, therefore, for many of you, you don't come into day-to-day contact with the construction industry. But if I asked you straight away to tell me what the image of the construction industry was, it might well be that piece of rail refurbishment going outside the Golden Tulip Hotel. You've been watching them? Well, I get a little bit more interested in stuff like that than you do, probably. That is absolutely standard, typical. There were 8 people on the team this morning when I looked out the window about 8:30. For 5 minutes, none of them moved. And in the 10 minutes I watched, 2 of them moved and 1 of them did something useful with that movement. Now, of course, the other 6 may have been thinking and planning. Of course, they may have been doing that. You and I both know what the image of construction is. You know, worse than that, it's a pretty dangerous industry. Outside farming, it's the most dangerous industry. You have all, I suspect, immediately thought about it as something that happens on a site, on a construction site, that's got really unwelcoming hoardings around it, that basically says, keep out, this is dangerous. And everybody goes into schools, in fact, very, very good schemes like the Considerate Constructors scheme, and I'm sorry I can't pronounce it in Dutch, remind me? Bewuste bouwers, which is about the better presentation of construction sites, because that is our shop window, is kind of what people think construction is about. And it sort of is, it's the last bit, it's the assembly bit, you know, but so it is an important factor. But the point is, sites are dangerous. And if you can't produce an industry which is actually an industry where you can be confident that someone leaves home in the morning and goes home to their family healthy and able to walk tonight, then you've got no license to trade. You do not deserve a license to trade. And as a sector, we came under massive political pressure in the late 1990s when the same man, the Deputy Prime Minister, spotted that 160 people had died that year on UK construction sites, and that was no blip. It was a slight blip caused by quite a rapid upturn, quite a sucking in of new people who weren't necessarily trained correctly. But it's a long-term trend, that was the trend. That is a significant achievement, therefore, to improve the safety of the industry by 70%. We have a long way to go. 42 people died on UK construction sites last year. So the number is down by 75%. Per capita, also per GDP, allowing for that factor, it's still 70% better than it was. We're still causing grief in 42 different families per year. A long way to go. What caused that innovation? Is that innovation? Do you see that as innovation? It's certainly improvement. It's certainly continuous improvement. What caused it? Political pressure. The chief executives of some very big companies, wow, that really is not acceptable. Once they were shown the data, once they were shown the social view of that coming from, said that's not acceptable in my company. And top down, for corporate social responsibility reasons, you saw an awful lot of companies and their clients, you people who are buying construction, it's still your site. The people in your community will remember it was your site long after the contractor has gone home and finished their job. It's you who own that for 60 years. And if for whatever reason in this or in any other of the metrics, if you don't like that metric, waste to landfill. You know, the biggest cause of waste to landfill, we're running out of landfill in the UK, I'm absolutely certain you must be as well. You know, we're starting to charge to try and stop anything that taken to landfill unnecessarily. Construction is the biggest single contributor to landfill. We've improved that by 30%. That was off the back of taxation. Again, you can call it innovation. You have a typical figure on our demonstration project, 95% recycling of construction waste. And fit out, by the way, is obviously often one of the biggest sinners in this respect. But now, even in your lifetime, I suspect, what you'll have seen, certainly in the UK, and I can't, I don't know whether the Netherlands is in the same position. I think you generally tend to be more socially responsible, not quite as selfish, if you like, not quite as short-sighted. But generally now on construction sites, you will have the recycling bins or the recycling skips, and materials will be sorted at source, not often reused on the site. There are exceptions to that, aggregate in particular, but at least it is collected and put in a position then to be taken to recycling facilities. That's a big change in construction. It's come along with domestic recycling only for us in the last 10 years. I think you've had that longer. Fit out's still a challenge because where you don't actually have a site necessarily, you don't have necessarily somewhere where you can take all that material and nicely sort it, because you're working in occupied premises in very congested space. We've been monitoring demonstrations. We've now had 600. About 1/3 of those have been in housing. I'm not saying a lot about housing. You're the housing experts. So I sort of tended to focus on construction more generally. But they've come from all shapes and sizes and all parts of the UK. That's a barrier to innovation. We do some great stuff in London. Well, we have mega projects in London, things like the Olympic Games and Crossrail at the moment, Terminal 5 before that. And everybody in Manchester said, oh yes, well that's London. You can't learn from that. It's a real barrier in our industry as well, and I think it's different in housing, but construction doesn't really learn intellectually. It doesn't learn by intellectualizing. It doesn't learn by sitting in a classroom like this and sharing ideas, although it does. It's much better at learning by actually doing it. And if you can't do it, at least take them to see it, and then they start to get it. Now, we can discuss why that might be, if you like, but it's a learning by doing type of industry, rather than, I realise there I'm using learning and innovation interchangeably, perhaps incorrectly. Anyway, the point about demonstration projects